Ace of spades, ace of clubs, eight of spades, eight of clubs. Poker players have been talking about those cards for nearly 150 years. Four quiet little pieces of pasteboard, resting on a wooden poker table in a crowded saloon in Deadwood, Dakota Territory, sometime in the late afternoon of August 2nd, 1876. Across from them sat a man whose name had already traveled farther than most men ever would, and usually arrived before he did. By the end of that afternoon, it would travel even farther. His name was Wild Bill Hickok, gunfighter, lawman, professional gambler, depending on the day. A man who had survived shootouts, outlaws, and enough angry men to fill half the frontier. But on that particular afternoon, the danger wasn't from across the table. It came from behind him. The shot echoed through the saloon. Wild Bill Hickok fell forward onto the table, still holding those cards. And ever since that moment, poker players have known them by a different name, the dead man's hand. Ask around any poker room long enough and the story eventually surfaces. Someone swears the hand is cursed. Someone else claims it's lucky. Most players just smile when they see it and quietly wonder how the hand that killed a frontier legend keeps finding its way back into the deck. Now, stories around a poker table have a habit of growing legs over the years. By the time they reach the third whiskey and the fourth retelling, the truth can start wearing boots 2 sizes larger than it came with. But even after you brush off the dust and exaggeration, the bones of this one remain stubbornly real. A famous gunfighter, a frontier boomtown, a poker game on a hot summer afternoon, and a man walking quietly up behind the most dangerous gambler in the room. James Butler Hickok had been famous long before Deadwood ever appeared on a map. Back in the 1860s, folks across the frontier already knew the name Wild Bill. Some of that reputation came from his time as a scout during the Civil War. Some of it came from his work as a lawman in places like Hays City and Abilene, Kansas. And a good portion of it came from gunfights, real ones, the kind that ended with a body in the street and a crowd forming before the dust had settled. One of the most famous happened in 1865 in a town square in Springfield, Missouri. Hickok faced a gambler named Tutt across roughly 75 yards of open ground. Now, 75 yards is a long way to settle an argument with revolvers. Most men would have been happy just hitting the side of a barn at that distance. Hickok took careful aim, squeezed the trigger, and Tutt dropped dead in the street. Word of that traveled fast. By the time newspapers back east got hold of the story, Wild Bill Hickok had begun turning into something larger than life. A frontier figure who carried 2 Navy Colts and the calm confidence of a man who had already survived more gunfights than most people would even dream of. But fame on the frontier carried a certain problem. Every young hothead who wanted to make a name for himself knew exactly how to do it. Beat the legend or kill him. So over time, Hickok grew cautious in small ways that only gamblers and gunfighters tend to understand. One of those habits showed up whenever cards hit the table. He liked his chair against the wall, back protected, eyes on the room. That kind of habit comes from experience. If you've spent years watching men get angry over cards, money, or pride, you develop a healthy interest in knowing who's standing behind you. Poker rooms can be friendly places. They can also turn ugly in about 3 seconds, usually right after someone says the words, "friendly game." I once watched 2 fellas nearly come to blows over a pot that couldn't have bought a decent pair of boots. Cards have a funny way of turning small disagreements into loud ones. And in Wild Bill Hickok's line of work, loud disagreements often involved gunpowder. On the frontier, a poker table carried a different kind of risk than it does today. There were no pit bosses. No cameras in the ceiling. No security stepping in when tempers climb too high. Just money on the table, pride in the room, and a collection of men who all happened to be carrying revolvers. A bad beat could empty a man's poke in 10 minutes, and men have done foolish things over far smaller sums. Sometimes over a sum they'd already spent. An accusation of cheating could empty the room even faster. In places like Deadwood, the distance between a poker hand and a gunshot was sometimes no farther than the length of the table. And in the summer of 1876, Deadwood was full of men willing to test that distance. By the summer of 1876, Hickok had drifted into Deadwood, which was barely a town at the time. It was more like a loud, muddy argument between gold miners, gamblers, drifters, merchants, and anyone else who believed fortune might be hiding somewhere in the Black Hills. The streets were crowded, the saloons stayed busy, and poker tables never seemed to cool down. Gold towns had a rhythm to them. Men spent the morning digging for it. They spent the evening trying to win it from each other. On August 2nd, the heat of the afternoon hung over Deadwood like a wool blanket. Inside Nuttal and Mann Saloon, sometimes called Saloon Number 10, a poker game was already underway. Cards sliding across the table, chips clinking, the low murmur of men calculating risks that probably felt smaller than they were. Wild Bill Hickok joined the table sometime that afternoon. Accounts differ on exactly when. What they do agree on is something unusual happened when he sat down. His usual seat, the one with his back to the wall, was already taken. Now that might not sound like much, but small details tend to matter when a man is made a life surviving gunfighters. Hickok reportedly asked the player to trade seats. The man refused. Maybe he didn't want to move. Maybe he didn't quite understand the request. Maybe he simply figured a chair was just a chair. So for once in his life, Wild Bill Hickok took a seat with his back to the room. It made him uneasy. Witnesses later said he mentioned it more than once. A man with enemies learns to listen to small instincts, and that afternoon, something felt off. Not that Wild Bill Hickok was a stranger to uneasy feelings. By the time he'd moved to Deadwood, he was already past the years when men build their legends. The eyesight that had once made him deadly with a revolver had begun to trouble him. Old injuries followed him around like unpaid debts, and the frontier that had once made him famous was slowly moving on without him. Railroads were pushing west. Towns were growing more civilized. A man who had once been the most dangerous gunfighter on the plains now spent more of his time behind a stack of poker chips, which in its own quiet way is how a great many frontier stories end. Not in the street, not in a duel, but at a table. Sometimes history turns on grand battles, and sometimes it turns on a chair nobody bothered to move. Among the men drifting through Deadwood that week was a fella named Jack McCall, 24, maybe 25 years old, a drifter, a gambler of the sort who never seemed to be holding enough money for the next game. He'd crossed paths with Hickok before, at least once over a poker table. Accounts suggest McCall had lost money to Hickok the day before the shooting. Hickok reportedly gave the young man a little advice, told him he ought to stop playing cards until he could afford it, and then handed him a few dollars for breakfast. Now, gamblers will tell you losing money stings. Being pitied after losing money can sting worse. Whether pride, anger, whiskey, or something darker was turning in McCall's head, nobody can say for certain. What we do know is that sometime in the late afternoon, Jack McCall walked into that saloon, and he wasn't there to play cards. Back in the saloon, the poker game continued. Men leaning forward over the felt, chips sliding, cards turning. Hickok held 4 of them in his hand. Black aces, black eights, 2 pairs. A strong hand in almost any poker game played on the frontier, and the last one Wild Bill Hickok would ever hold. Behind him, footsteps. Slow, quiet. Close. Close enough that a careful man might have turned around. Jack McCall stepped up behind Wild Bill Hickok, drew a Colt revolver, and fired once into the back of Hickok's head. The sound cracked through the saloon like a board snapping in half. Hickok pitched forward onto the table. The card spilled from his hand. The poker game ended in a single heartbeat. Men jumped from their chairs. Some froze. Some reached for their own guns. McCall tried to run. He didn't make it far. A crowd caught him outside the saloon before he could disappear into the streets of Deadwood. Inside, the table sat silent, the kind of silence that follows sudden violence. Hickok's cards lay scattered on the wood. Ace of spades, ace of clubs, 8 of spades, 8 of clubs, and a 5th card, face down. No one seems to agree on what that 5th card was. Some say it was the 9 of diamonds. Others claim nobody ever checked. Historians have argued about it for nearly a century and a half, but there's always someone at the local bar who swears he knows. In a moment like that, details tend to scatter. But the 4 black cards stayed in people's memories and slowly found their way into poker folklore. The kind of story that keeps turning up wherever gamblers gather. The sort folks around a card table might call a legend of the felt. Jack McCall faced what passed for justice in Deadwood at the time. A miners' court, the sort frontier towns put together when there wasn't anything resembling a real courthouse. Frontier justice worked quickly, sometimes a little too quickly. The frontier had a certain bluntness to it, the kind history sometimes smooths over later. McCall claimed he shot Hickok to avenge a brother Hickok had supposedly killed years earlier. The story didn't hold much water. Still, the jury found him not guilty. Deadwood had a habit of improvising its laws. That decision didn't last long because Deadwood sat in a strange legal gray area at the time. Federal authorities later ruled that the miners' court had no proper jurisdiction. Deadwood technically sat on land that still belonged to the Lakota Sioux, and McCall wasn't exactly the brightest fellow in town. He'd gone and bragged about the killing in Wyoming, so federal authorities arrested him again. This time the trial took place in Yankton, the territorial capital. In December of 1877, Jack McCall was found guilty of murder. He was hanged on March 1st, 1877. Wild Bill Hickok was buried in Deadwood's Mount Moriah Cemetery, not far from another frontier legend who would arrive a few years later, Calamity Jane. Wild Bill had once stared down men in dusty streets and now rested on a hillside overlooking the same rough town where his luck finally ran out. And somewhere along the way, the story followed the cards wherever poker was played. 2 black aces, 2 black 8s, the hand Wild Bill Hickok was holding when fate finally caught up with him. Poker players gave it a name, the dead man's hand. Now every card room has its share of superstitions. Lucky seats, unlucky decks, players who swear the cards remember things. Gamblers aren't the most careful philosophers the world has ever produced, but they do spend an awful lot of time thinking about luck. And chance has a strange sense of humor, because when you think about it, Wild Bill Hickok had survived some of the most dangerous situations the American frontier could offer. Gunfights, outlaws, rowdy cattle towns, years of men quietly wondering whether today might be the day they tried their luck against him. And in the end, it happened during something as ordinary as a poker game. Cards on a table, chips in a pile, an afternoon hand that could have ended like 1,000 others. I suppose that's part of why the story stuck. It reminds gamblers of something they already suspect. Luck can run strong for a long time. Then one day, it changes its mind. Usually that only cost a fella a stack of chips. For Wild Bill Hickok, the stakes turned out a little higher. And somewhere out there tonight, in a quiet poker room, someone will pick up 2 black aces and 2 black eights. Maybe they'll smile. Maybe they'll hesitate. Maybe they'll remember the afternoon in Deadwood when those 4 quiet little pieces of pasteboard lay on a wooden table just seconds before a gunshot turned them into legend. Ace of spades, ace of clubs, 8 of spades, 8 of clubs. And somewhere in that long-ago saloon, a 5th card still lies face down on the table, exactly where Wild Bill Hickok left it all those years ago. There are other gambling stories worth remembering. Some of them even end happily. If you're still here, pull up a chair. The house never closes.